Okay, the second of the four budgetary supply-side policies we're going to be looking at is the provision of subsidies and a range of different subsidies the government can offer to try and help businesses out, reduce their costs of production. So first of all, the definition of a subsidy. The subsidy is referred to as any sort of government assistance provided to local producers, or any form of financial assistance or other form of assistance. So when we say other forms of assistance, that can include concessional loans, which basically means they get access to loans at a cheaper interest rate, tax concessions, which allow them to inflate their expenditures and things like that. And the aim of subsidies is any government provided financial assistance, including those things that help to reduce firms' costs of production and in some cases encourage them to restructure and become more productive in the long term. But all I'd be saying is that first part and then that help to reduce firms' cost of production. Okay. You'll also hear the word industry policy. Industry policy is basically just any government policy designed to help the development of local industries. So it's generally associated with assistance given by the government to local Australian industries. So industry policy is basically policies that help to develop local industries. In the past, they've been about special assistance in terms of subsidies and tariffs to try and promote particular industries. Where now they're sort of more looked at the net economy-wide benefits, and they've been a bit of a tweak in terms of how they've used industry policy. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the next video. So basically, subsidies can include anything to help cover the costs of production for businesses. So wage subsidies would be an example, or just general cash subsidies given to businesses. They can be subsidies to offset losses to avoid business closures. So they might give them a subsidy when they're experiencing financial hardship to prevent them from closing down. It also includes any loans or grants for businesses in particular industries. So they may receive a concessional loan or something from the government as well. Here's an example of some different types of subsidies. So manufacturing is generally provided with the largest subsidies because in the past they were not as competitive. We have subsidies for relief assistance. So when workers are experiencing droughts, particularly in the farming sector. Wage subsidies, so like $10,000 subsidies to employ people over 50, subsidies to hire long-term unemployed or Indigenous or disabled workers, all designed to promote employment. Subsidies in the service industries, childcare subsidies to try and boost participation. We have the Emissions Reduction Fund, which we'll be talking about in this video. Export development grants, so basically grants given to businesses to help them to promote their businesses overseas. So export development grants are generally for export promotion activities. And then also subsidies given to employers to try and provide recruitments or provide businesses with recruitment services so they can help them to attract the right talent pool so that they can hire the right people. So what we're going to be talking about in this video is what we call the Emissions Reduction Fund. This is an example of a particular type of subsidy given to businesses to try and reduce the effects of climate change. So basically what it was a $2.55 billion fund. And the idea is that what they would do is they would hold reverse auctions. So businesses would come forward and propose projects where they would say, this is the amount of emissions that I'm able to reduce. I'm going to reduce my emissions by, and I want you to pay me this amount per level of emissions. So businesses would identify emissions reductions that go beyond their normal activities. Then they propose to the government how they would go about reducing their emissions further, and they would ask the government to pay them a certain amount of money per level of emissions. So what you would do is you would choose an approved method that allows you to reduce your emissions reductions. You'd register your project with what we call the Clean Energy Regulator or the government. Then basically every 3 months they would hold an auction. So all these different companies would come forward and they would say, this is how I'm going to reduce my emission reduction. So maybe through planting trees or investing in more renewable energy. And basically the government, it was a reverse auction, so the government would give subsidies to whatever businesses were able to reduce their emissions for the lowest price. So, for example, if one company said that they wanted to be paid $5 per emission reduction and another one said $8 per tonne of emission reductions, the government would give the subsidy to the one that would be willing to do it for $5. So, in the end, the idea is that we reduce our emissions because we're getting financial assistance to do so. So, the steps that the businesses are, they think of an activity to reduce their emissions, they choose an approved method and estimate how much their emission reductions they'll be able to achieve. They applied to get their emission reduction for the emissions reduction fund with the Clean Energy Regulator, and then they bid at auction to see if they can get the project. So whatever gets the lowest bid, who's willing to reduce their emissions at the cheapest price, will generally get rewarded contracts. Then they carry out the project to reduce their emissions, and they get given carbon credit units, which is basically money from the government because they were willing to reduce their emissions, or money per level of emission reductions. Okay, so finally, explain how the subsidisation of renewable energy might be associated with an increase in intertemporal efficiency and an increase in aggregate supply and economic growth in the long run. So how can we use subsidies for renewable energy to try and achieve increased intertemporal efficiency and aggregate supply? So clearly within your answer you want to define intertemporal efficiency, so it's achieved when well-being is maximised over periods of time, so that we're looking after the future or have an eye to the future as well as looking after the current generations. For example, excessive production and consumption in the current period might reduce the living standards of future generations. This would be deemed to be intertemporally inefficient. Subsidisation of renewable energy would reduce its relative price. Okay, we're looking back at relative prices now. So by subsidising renewable energy, it helps to reduce the relative price of investment, so they'll be subsidising away from more carbon emitting or less clean energy sources. Producers will look for the cheaper option, and this subsidy would enable them to implement new technology that reduces their production costs. So the idea is that it makes the investment in technology cheaper, so they're more likely to reduce their emissions. If coal and gas-fired sources of electricity are replaced by renewable sources, current generations' needs and wants might be met without reducing the living standards of future generations. So by investing in renewable energy, we can meet the needs of the present without sacrificing the future. Coal producers, and then explain why, what are the problems with emitting carbon dioxide. So coal producers emit carbon dioxide, and that can lead to climate change. This can hurt future generations' ability to provide goods and services because of erratic weather patterns, droughts, etc., reducing the capacity to grow food. So provide some examples of what are some of the problems with climate change. The idea through this system is that Australia has a more established and reliable source of renewable energy. This will help to boost the ability of businesses to supply goods and services. With less disruptions caused by climate change, strong and sustainable growth might be more achievable in the long run, and living standards will be maintained. So you want to explain what intertemporal efficiency is, how subsidies impact relative price and promote investment spending, what are some of the problems with using carbon and how it can affect aggregate supply in the long term, and the benefits in the long term from switching to more renewable energy. Thank you.